It's a very interesting story, to say the least, even at face value, with a whole bunch of unexpected twists and turns, lots of suspense, high stakes, and everything culminating into a major happy ending. But we're not here to only look at the story aspect of it in terms of how interesting it is, even though we can get a nice movie or a nice novel playing out in our heads with this story. Also, we're not here to look at whether and how much of it played out in history, the way it's written in the story. But like with anything in the wisdom of Kabbalah, what we're going to be getting into today is looking at this story of Purim from its spiritual meaning and its spiritual perspective, looking at it through the lens of what's called the language of branches, where each word and each letter in these stories that we discuss, they all point to spiritual forces, spiritual structures, spiritual processes taking place. What does it mean spiritual? It means that these are things that are playing out in each and every person and at each and every moment of our lives right now. It doesn't have to do with anything imaginary, fantasy. It doesn't have to do with anything that played out in history, even though lots of the events might correspond to all kinds of historical events that took place at a certain period of time. However, we're mostly interested in looking at this in terms of how does it play out in you, in me, in society in general, and especially how does it play out in our spiritual progress as we're moving from this world to what's called the spiritual world, or the upper level of reality that we reveal through this wisdom. So that's what we're going to get into today. We'll look through an extended summary of this story, and then we'll see how all these, for example, names of people and places, we'll see what they mean in their spiritual context. Where are these things that are actually forces within a person playing out? And we'll look into that. This is Kabbalah Explained Simply. I'm Markos, and we're going to get into the story of Purim, its spiritual meaning, right after this. The purpose of creation and the purpose of all spiritual progress in this wisdom and in general that we learn about in the wisdom of Kabbalah is to shift from a state of what's our inborn egoistic nature, one of receiving benefit purely for ourselves alone. We're born into such a nature. We grow up only learning how to receive in all kinds of ways through corporeal desires of food, sex, family, money, honor, control, knowledge. And at a certain point, we develop this spark, this desire for spirituality. It's called a point in the heart. And this point in the heart essentially is characterized by asking the questions such as, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? Who are we? Where are we from? Where are we headed? Why is there so much suffering in the world? And it pushes us to seek answers to life's most existential and fundamental questions. So this point in the heart that emerges, and the wisdom of Kabbalah said that in our era especially, it's emerging in more and more people en masse because humanity in general has reached a level where we're starting to feel a satiation of all our corporeal desires, and we're moving into this new transition to a spiritual state of one where more and more people are seeking spiritual fulfillment because corporeal fulfillment no longer satisfies the way it used to, as it used to fulfill us throughout our development. So today we're reaching a state where more and more people are asking specifically about life's meaning and life's purpose, and aren't satisfied with previous answers we got to questions like that, because we genuinely seek something real, something true in relation to these questions. And the answer that the wisdom of Kabbalah comes to give is that we attain the purpose of creation when we correct our ego, or in other words, when we learn how to redirect our human nature of reception purely for our self-benefit alone, which, if we take a look at ourselves just for a moment and our desires and how they operate, so our desires at every single moment want to absorb pleasure into themselves, whether it's desires for food, sex, family, money, honor, control, knowledge. We understand it very succinctly, even at the level of food. Take the desire for food. If you're very hungry, then your desire is actively wanting a fulfillment. When that fulfillment reaches the pleasure that fulfills it, when you eat some food, so then you can understand how the desire starts becoming extinguished and dying away until we satiate that desire completely. We get our feed, and then we no longer have that desire and we start wanting other desires. So at the level of receiving pleasures purely for ourselves alone, our desires always get quenched, they always get extinguished, they can never truly be fulfilled. And the way to true fulfillment, or what's called spiritual fulfillment, is by learning how to acquire what's called a certain redirection upon our desires. It's called a tool in the wisdom of Kabbalah. We learn how to acquire a certain tool or a new sense. It's called a screen. Masach is the word for it in Hebrew. We attain this tool through the method, through the studies, at a certain point of our spiritual progress. And with this tool, we learn how to literally redirect desires so that they're not simply dying and extinguishing within us upon their reception, but we learn how to redirect them in a way where we learn how to bestow that pleasure back to the source, back to a source force of love, bestowal that wishes for us to receive that pleasure. We learn how to equalize in form, as it's called. We learn how to equalize our intention upon our innate desire to be similar to that force that created us. And that's called achieving the purpose of creation, because when we learn how to redirect our desire in such a way, we literally learn how to act and how to develop this attitude toward others, toward everything outside of us, and ultimately toward the source force of nature that created us, which in the wisdom of Kabbalah it's called the Creator. The word for creator in Hebrew is boreh. It comes from the two words bo'ureh, come and see, meaning that we learned how to come and see this full, true reality that creates us, that sustains us, by equalizing our form with its form, by equalizing our own intention to receive pleasure in a manner of bestowal and love back to that source force. And by doing so, we attain the same status of that force, which is an eternal and perfect, harmonious status where we learn how to balance ourselves with the ultimate laws of nature, the source laws of nature that are acting in our reality. And it's the key to attaining the genuine, lasting answer to that question of what is the meaning of life, because we attain what's called our soul in such a state. A soul meaning the desire which is completely fulfilled by pleasure, because we discover that place where the desire equalizes in form, equalizes in intention, back with the source that is constantly supplying it with pleasure. So that's in a nutshell the purpose of the wisdom of Kabbalah, which is synonymous with the purpose of creation, of why we were created here to begin with, to acquire this inversion upon our innate desire to receive pleasure, so that we're not just simply receiving for ourselves, but we learn how to give that pleasure outwardly and receive the pleasure in a way which never fades away then, because we're receiving it into this vessel of others, of what's outside of us, and we become similar in status to the Creator by doing so. So on the way to making such changes to achieve the purpose of creation, we go through all kinds of spiritual states, and those are what are known as the holidays. So one of those states, as we just learned here, is the state of Yom Kippur. Just to give a little bit of an example to situate us in terms of these holidays. So Yom Kippur is a certain state on that spiritual path where we reveal the emptiness of our egoistic nature, the emptiness of receiving purely for my benefit alone, and also our inability to correct ourselves by ourselves, meaning that you can't fight fire with fire. In other words, you can't correct ego from a place where you yourself are an egoist. And that's called Yom Kippur. It's called a day that's like Yom is the word for day in Hebrew, and Kippur means as Kippur, similar to Purim, in other words, a day that's like Purim. However, it's the opposite of Purim. It's like the flip side of Purim, because we're revealing this empty state. It's as Kippur because from that state, from the point when we have this revelation of our egoistic nature as an empty space that needs correction, that's when we already can picture the future final goal of creation to ourselves, which is described by Purim, which is what we're going to get into soon. In the middle point between Yom Kippur and Purim is a certain correction that takes place called correction of bestowal in order to bestow. That's called Hanukkah. Hanukkah translates into two words in Hebrew, Hanuko, meaning stop here or park here. It's like a stopping point, like stopping at a certain station on the way towards the what's called the final correction of our ego to being purely in a mode of bestowal, in an altruistic mode, in short, in a mode that gives and loves, similar to the Creator, which is a force of loving and giving. And on the way to achieving our final correction, what's called receiving in order to bestow. So there's a certain state called a correction of bestowing in order to bestow, which is called Hanukkah. It's not too important to get into these, it's just to situate us a little bit in the beginning here. And Purim describes the final correction. That's why Purim is actually very relevant to our current days in humanity, because the wisdom of Kabbalah Kabbalists, including Kabbalist Yehuda Ashlag, the most renowned Kabbalist of the 20th century, the greatest Kabbalist of the 20th century, as well as the Book of Zohar, all point to our period, the end of the 20th century and onward, as being the one when the wisdom of Kabbalah, and in general the purpose of creation and this desire for spirituality, this desire for meaning and purpose, and wanting real, genuine answers to these fundamental questions of life would emerge in humanity en masse, and more people would want genuine answers to those questions, meaning that our era is considered the one where humanity starts going in the direction of its ultimate purpose, where all people will start revealing this want for some genuine fulfillment to start fulfilling us. On one hand, it's represented by a state of increasing crises in our era, all kinds of problems that are expanding on personal, social, ecological, economic scales all around the world, which leave more and more people feeling empty in all kinds of ways, with the overblown, egoistic, corporeal way of life that's taking place all around us, meaning that unlike other periods throughout history where we were able to find some new revolution, some new way of being able to follow some new direction in our lives, where everyone would think in a certain society, okay, now we're going this way, we're moving in this new direction. We're no longer at a stage where anyone's confident with pointing in the new direction of going in a certain way, where we've reached a certain dead end of our materialistic, corporeal development. And it's precisely in order for us to reveal more and more problems and crises in our current way of life, and that we need to start redirecting ourselves in that way that we said before. We start learning how to redirect our attitudes to each other, our intentions toward each other, in a manner which is similar to the laws of nature themselves, similar to those forces of love and bestowal, giving, positively connecting to one another, that when we do so, we'll start developing a new sensation that we currently don't feel, a new sensation where we open a new space for a new kind of fulfillment to fulfill us that we haven't yet felt, by developing a new kind of way of relating to each other, where we relate to each other in this mode of mutual giving and love and bestowal. That we'll talk more about. This is just a little bit of an intro into getting into the story of Purim. What we're going to get into now is we'll start opening up this story of Purim just as we said, an extended summary, going through bit by bit of the story. We're not opening up the whole story because we don't have time for that. There are going to be a lot of little details that'll be missed, but we're going to try to get some broad strokes and all kinds of spiritual meanings from people, places, events taking place, and what we can learn from that. So, without further ado, let's start getting into it. King Ahasuerus was having a royal festive meal, drinking wine, etc., and commanded his 7 chamberlains to bring out Queen Vashti, his wife, to show off her beauty to the other royals. Queen Vashti refused the king's command and didn't appear. The king was furious with this, divorced her, and ordered to have her killed. So, to start with King Ahasuerus, it's talking about the creator, which in the wisdom of Kabbalah is synonymous with nature, which describes a desire to bestow, or the force of love and bestowal. Queen Vashti is what's known as a corrupt desire to receive. So what does it mean, a corrupt desire to receive, or a desire to receive that has become corrupted? So like we see with several stories in the wisdom of Kabbalah, where we start off in a united state, a state of goodness, as it says, that there's a royal festive meal, there's wine, everything's good, everything's pleasant in the city, and then a certain breakage occurs, a certain occurrence takes place. What's the occurrence? It's that this desire called Queen Vashti, the desire to receive, which once was fit to be together with the king, all of a sudden it's not obeying the king's orders, meaning that there's a certain desire to receive that doesn't obey the laws of nature anymore. It's not in congruence with the laws of nature anymore. This desire thus cuts off from nature by receiving pleasure for its own personal benefit. It doesn't do as nature commands it, and thus it's killed as a result of that. What does it mean that it gets killed? Here we don't need to think of some ruthless king killing a desire. We can just look at our own desires as an example. Even that desire I mentioned earlier of food. Have a desire to receive, and we fill it internally with the pleasure going in and directly into the desire for personal benefit alone. That desire gets killed, it gets extinguished, it gets quenched. That desire no longer exists. We kill the desire from it being in a state of incongruence with nature itself. By it being opposite to the force of bestowal and love, and receiving only for itself alone, the desire ultimately kills itself. That's what it's talking about here, that there's this desire that was once in a mode of bestowal and love, which was once in a correct mode, and at this point the desire no longer operates in that mode, and it gets killed off. So moving on a bit. Mordechai the Jew raised his niece Esther as his own daughter. Mordechai told Esther not to make it known that she was a Jew. We'll talk a bit about that. That's actually where Esther gets her name. Esther coming from the word for concealment, astara, that she conceals the fact that she's a Jew until later in the story. We'll get into that. King Ahasuerus was impressed by Esther and made Esther his wife, and thus queen. So Mordechai is considered this righteous quality of loyalty to the king, the creator. Righteousness, Mordechai also, it's said in the story that Mordechai, in the beginning of the story, and if it wasn't for all kinds of events that took place throughout the story, he sits at the king's gate, meaning that Mordechai is this quality. If we go back to this, if we think of this point of Keter being the pure source force of bestowal and love, representing the king in the story, so Mordechai is this quality of Bina. Bina being what's known as the quality of mercy, having no desire to receive at all that's active in it, but only wishing to bestow and to love just like the Creator. And the fact that Mordechai sits at the king's gate and stays there all the time, it's representing this inner quality, this inner spiritual quality, which wishes only to serve the king. And sitting at the king's gate, meaning that it's ready for any kind of command coming from the king in order to serve the king, meaning that a quality of righteousness, meaning that it's completely loyal to this quality of bestowal and love, wanting only to serve it. And if there's nothing activating it, so it's just sitting there at the gate, it's just waiting there at the gate. And Mordechai had a niece that he raised as his daughter called Esther, which represents the corrected desire to receive, a new desire to receive that can acquire the rule of the king over her. As we said, that she conceals the fact that she's a Jew. That's where the name Esther comes from the word for astara, meaning concealment. And this quality of concealing a concealed desire to receive, meaning that that's actually what makes this desire corrected in this current situation right here. That a desire that can conceal receiving all the pleasures for itself and wish to receive all the pleasures only to benefit the king, meaning all the pleasures to benefit the creator in return, it's called a correct mode of the desire operating. While Mordechai was at the king's gate, he learned that two of the king's chamberlains, Bigtan and Teresh, wanted to assassinate the king. And so he told Esther, who told the king, and they got hanged. Okay, so what's happening here is that Bigtan and Teresh represents what's called klipot on the left and the right. What does this mean? If you think of this system that we just saw before of the 10 sfirot, so you see that there's right side and left side. So there's a certain klipot in this system, and it's the role of these klipot. The klipot simply means, klipot literally translates to shells. It's desires that aim to use what's coming from the creator for personal benefit alone within this system. So this plot to assassinate the king that came about from Bigtan and Teresh, it simply means that there's certain forces working in this system which wish to use the forces extending from the source force of the Creator, forces of love and bestowal, for personal benefit alone, which ultimately means that, as we talked about, how that means to kill a certain desire. And so Mordechai, since he's on the lookout all the time, since there's this quality of Bina, which is there to serve the king, identifies these forces and then passes through Esther, which is in contact with the king, to get them hanged, meaning to get rid of these impure forces from the system. And then, as a result of this, the king didn't promote Mordechai, he rather promoted Haman to be head of all the ministers, princes, and king's servants. Haman was an other side, you could say the flip side of Mordechai. Haman in the story represents human egoism, and not just any human egoism, but specifically the heights of human egoism, desires for honor, desires for power, desires within us that wish to have self-rule and not to acknowledge the Creator's rule over everything. Those are the desires called Haman. These are our own desires for honor and power, which want me to be in control over anything outside of me, which make me feel like I'm number one in the world, and not that there's some laws of nature out there or a creator out there, a quality of love and giving out there, which it is number one. And so this is already one of the first really confusing things in the story when we're looking at it just from face value, that Mordechai saved the king's life. He picked out 2 assassins that were going to kill him. They hanged these assassins. And instead of Mordechai getting promoted, so this other one, Haman, got promoted. So already here we start seeing that the King Ahasuerus, or the creator operating behind the scenes of everything, has a certain plan, has a certain something going on here that we're not really seeing yet in this story. Later we'll get to see why he does this, but this is a major aspect of the Purim story, and it's also a major aspect of our spiritual progress in general, that what happens is that we do a certain, what you could call a good action. We advance the forces of love and bestowal upon the desire to receive pleasure for personal benefit alone, which is called the ego, which detaches us from spirituality. And we make moves in that spiritual direction. And what happens as a result of making moves in a spiritual direction? Our ego is grown as a result. Not that we get more and more spiritual desire linearly expanding more and more and more the more we move forward spiritually, but rather we make some effort towards spirituality, meaning we make some effort to love and bestow outwardly toward the Creator, however we understand it. We do some efforts like this, and a result of this, we rather feel a bigger ego playing out inside of us. The ego gets promoted and not the spiritual desire. So this is something very fundamental in our spiritual progress, that what's happening is that the ego constantly grows more and more and more, and it happens for a certain purpose, and we're going to learn what that purpose is very soon. Mordechai, however, since he was a Jew, didn't bow down to Haman. He only bowed down to the king. When Haman learned that Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him, he was furious, and he wished to destroy all the Jews as a result. Okay? So Jews, in this situation, Yehudim, comes from the word for united, meuchadim. But let's just talk about this bit of story that we just read now, because there's another perplexing thing that happened here. Okay, so first the king promotes Haman after Mordechai saved his life, which doesn't connect to our human logic. When we understand spiritual progress, however, we understand that the more we put efforts into a spiritual direction, the more we try to love, bestow, connect, we might do some good deeds in that direction, and our ego gets grown as a result. In the last excerpt that we just read, we start learning why that's the case. Let's just go through it again. So Mordechai, since he was a Jew, didn't bow down to Haman. So our ego grows, Haman gets promoted, Haman's now the king of all the ministers, all the princes, all the king's servants, all the slaves. But Mordechai, this one person there, or you could say Mordechai, which is that quality of Bina, only bows down to the king. He doesn't bow down to any other forces in reality. And so Haman, our egoistic desires for power, for honor, They hate the fact that there's this other small point in the heart within us. You could say that Mordechai is the point in the heart. It represents the point in the heart. The point in the heart is also called the point of God from above. It's called that point of Bina, a point within us which cannot be fulfilled at the level of egoistic fulfillments, but which points us always in the direction of what's true behind all of the corporeal, material, egoistic fulfillments, because it wants that pure connection with God. It wants that pure connection with the Creator. It wants that pure connection with wishing to love and bestow and accept that rule of love and bestowal over itself. It's that small desire within us called the point in the heart. That's actually the Mordechai that's playing out here. So that point cannot accept any kind of egoistic rule upon itself, because it's rooted in bestowing back to the Creator. It's rooted in this quality of Bina that played out in the concatenation down of all kinds of states that led to the creation of ourselves as we know ourselves in our reality. So this point of Mordechai, this point in the heart, since that's what a Jew is, this point within us, and Jews is the connection between these points that we all share. So each person with that point in the heart who develops this attitude of love, bestowal, positive connection to others upon this entire sack of ego that each one has, that's what makes a certain collective called Jews. Meaning Jews doesn't come from, even Jews as we know the word Jews in our world, that it was never a biological race. It was never a biological grouping of people. Rather, there was this grouping of people among humanity. At the time it was humanity, among the ancient Babylonians, who gathered around Abraham. And this people, they didn't have a biological foundation because there was just all the Babylonians who were there at the time. But a certain group of them who followed Abraham, meaning they followed the method that Abraham gave them, which is the method of Kabbalah. What's the method? It's a method of reaching a state of love your friend as yourself, love thy neighbor as thyself, love will cover all crimes, as it's written in the stories back then, that there was a crisis of social division at the time. We know that as the story of the Tower of Babel that was playing out there, and which caused a whole bunch of mess and a whole bunch of everyone not understanding each other, etc., etc. Abraham grouped people together, people who started feeling as a result of that crisis that was happening at the time, as a feeling that there's some kind of error in that social division that was rampant at the time. So certain people who felt the problem with that and who wanted to move towards something much more meaningful, they are the ones who had that original awakening of that point in the heart within them. And they gathered around Abraham, who guided them with the method that he discovered to discover that common connection among each other, between each other, the connection which comes from attracting the forces from that source force of connection itself, which is called the Creator. So that original grouping of people who discovered how to love, who discovered how to develop this umbrella relationship and attitude of love toward one another by attaining that original equivalence of form with the Creator, that's called the Jews. That there were these people with the points in the heart who developed using the method to acquire that tool to redirect that pleasure from simply inwardly dissipating into each one individually to moving that direction of pleasure toward wishing to positively connect to one another and forming this grouping based on that force that comes and dwells between them. So that's the Jews in this situation. So that point is within each and every one of us, that one called Jew. It's not something that comes from a biological basis. So that point only bows down to the source that created it. It recognizes only the King Ahasuerus, and it doesn't recognize the rule of Haman. So when Haman learned that Mordechai wouldn't bow down to him, he was furious, and as a result he wanted to destroy all the Jews, which also is perplexing. You know, how come now Haman, which is this expanded now, Haman got promoted, meaning that the egoistic desires for honor and power now are fully rampant, right? So our desires for power, desires for honor, these big egoistic desires within ourselves, they hate that point in the heart, because the point in the heart is saying that it doesn't recognize their rule, doesn't see them as anything special. The point in the heart within us only wants to connect with the Creator, and so the ego wants to destroy that. It wants nothing to do with that. It sees that point in the heart as an obstacle to its own self-worth, to its own feeling of self-rule. And so that's what it means that Haman wants to now destroy not just Mordechai, but all Jews as a result. Let's keep going. Haman told King Ahasuerus that the Jews were dispersed, scattered, and not following the king's laws, and asked the king's approval to kill them. King Ahasuerus approved. Haman then set up all-out genocide on the Jews to kill every Jew, including women and children. Yeah. So you can also say in our world we see branch levels of this phenomenon in anti-Semitism as well. The addition here that we just learnt about is the fact that Haman said that the justifying reason for killing all the Jews that Haman said to King Ahasuerus was that they're dispersed and scattered, meaning this division among the Jews, the fact that people who have, on one hand you could say people who have this point in the heart, who are granted this ability to be able to rise above their nature, if they're not grouping with others and working with others in order to develop that ability, in order to strengthen that common connection they have and strengthen that a small point in the heart, to have that connection between those points and start strengthening in that spiritual unity above the egoistic desires. So then the egoism sees it possible to simply move forward and get rid of any kind of inkling that they might have towards coming together and to kill them off. And we see branch level phenomena of this in our reality in the form of anti-Semitism. We won't expand on that a lot. There's lots of material written by Kabbalist Dr. Michael Laitman, by the way, on this topic. You can really just get into it. If you go to his website, michaellaitman.com, you'll see there books, full books is written on the phenomenon. But we'll just touch on the topic a little bit for now and focus on it more from the purely spiritual perspective here. And this made Mordechai, for the first time, wish to go beyond the king's gate, to which he was met with the king's servants who would not let him through. He then stated that Esther should not consider herself any more protected than all Jews for being in the king's house, and if the Jews unite now, then they'll get relief and deliverance, and asked Esther to beg the king to spare the Jews. Esther then commanded Mordechai to gather together the Jews in Shushan, and that they fast, and he obeyed. So what's happening here? So as we said earlier, Mordechai, this quality which was just sitting at the king's gate, meaning this quality of Bina, which is ready to be loyal to the king, which is ready to do the king's bidding, to do anything for the king, up until the point where Haman declared all-out genocide on the Jews. So all he did was sit at the king's gate. He didn't really do anything other than that. And when there was that opportunity that Bigtan and Teresh wanted to plot an assassination on the king, so he acted then. And here too, since Haman came up and is risen, and this big desire to receive wants to eliminate the spiritual desire, so it starts actually scratching that spiritual desire. Suddenly that spiritual desire, that point in the heart which was just sitting at the king's gate, all of a sudden it's going left and right, doing every possible thing, because Mordechai doesn't want to do anything for himself. He wants to purely serve the king and also to serve the people. He only has this outward mode of wishing to bestow outwardly, like the Creator himself. So what's happened now is, and now we start seeing the reason why the king promoted Haman and not Mordechai, because by promoting the ego, by increasing and growing the egoistic desires, it forces the spiritual desires to start getting activated. Mordechai now is activated, he's in action mode, he's going around, he's trying to save the Jews, and he's trying to go beyond the gate, he's talking to Esther, telling Esther, go beg the king to save the Jews. However, Esther comes back at him and says, you want to spare the Jews, you need to pass the message on to the Jews that they need to unite. He says that they should fast, meaning fasting, here we'll show this here, fasting means a renunciation of egoistic fulfillment. So in order for the Jews to spare their life, it's not enough that Mordechai, this one strong point in the heart, goes around making requests left, right and center. Rather, he gets the message sent back to him that he needs to pass a message on to all the Jews, meaning all the Jews need to take this message from that deeper, higher point of the point in the heart within them, meaning each and every person who has a point in the heart, that point in the heart itself has layers, and its deeper point is the upper level of that point. So to accept from, for example, teachers, Kabbalists who are there before them, who give the teaching of the wisdom of Kabbalah, to accept that teaching and to start learning what it means to rise to the levels that these Kabbalists are talking about. In this case, it says that they should fast for 3 days. What does it mean? It means that they renounce their egoistic fulfillments for a certain period of time, meaning that the Jews themselves in this story, they're mingled with all the egoistic desires, and that's why Haman, the great egoism, thinks that it can get rid of them completely. Since they're already scattered and dispersed among the egoistic desires, since we have spiritual desires immersed among egoistic desires, and let's say we're in a materialistic environment that supports the advancement of our egoistic goals, to make money on all accounts, to get famous, to advance in rungs of power of all kinds, etc., etc. So it says, just keep focusing in that direction. Haman's saying, just keep focusing in that direction, and we'll kill the spiritual desires. There'll be no more questions about the meaning of life. You'll find your meaning, you'll find everything within the fulfillments of the ego. So Esther tells Mordechai to tell the Jews, look, you guys, if you want your lives saved, if you want your lives back, so you need to unite, you need to fast, you need to renounce your egoistic fulfillments. Again, we're not talking about fasting in a physical sense, even though there's certain parallels there. We're talking about fasting as a certain action of not receiving that egoistic pleasure inwardly for ourselves, getting into that mode of being ready to start bestowing and connecting to the fellow man. Esther requested from the king that he and Haman come to a banquet that she would prepare. The king agreed, and Haman was happy about the request. But when Haman saw Mordechai sitting at the king's gate, he got very angry again, and said that the joy he felt from the banquet meant nothing, since Mordechai was still alive. Zeresh, Haman's wife, then recommended Haman prepare gallows for hanging Mordechai, and prepared to ask the king at the banquet for permission to execute Mordechai. Yeah, so we see the appearance of this Zeresh, also a corrupt desire to receive. You see this one appearance of Zeresh is from that side of Haman and Haman's family, everything in relation to that egoistic desire for power. What's Zeresh doing here? She's representing this desire to harm others and to feel pleasure by harming others. It's this corrupt form of a desire to receive that also is included within that whole desire, which is called Haman. King Ahasuerus then was read the book of records of the Chronicles, where he heard that it was Mordechai who discovered the plot to kill him by Bigtan and Teresh. And he asked his ministers what reward Mordechai got for this, to which they said, nothing. Why did he get nothing? Because he himself is a desire to bestow, is a quality of bestowal, is that quality of bina, which itself has no desire for any kinds of rewards. So this is why Mordechai never got that reward to begin with, but it all went to Haman. Yeah, Mordechai, the quality of bestowal, receives no reward because it has no active desire to receive any reward. Haman then went to the king, to which the king asked him what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman thought that the king was talking about him, and so Haman laid out his requests, which included various royal apparel, and to ride a horse in the streets of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." One of the things in the story is seeing how the king really has the whole plan in his head, and all these relations between Haman, Mordechai, Esther, Jews, everything playing out. The king's got it all planned in advance. It's just like we learn in the wisdom of Kabbalah, that the plan of creation, it's all predetermined. The Creator has this plan for everything and is behind everything. There's a saying in the wisdom of Kabbalah that there is none else besides Him, there is none else besides the Creator, that everything that could possibly happen has all been predetermined. And all these events taking place are characters that are responding to all kinds of impulses coming into them. So the king here very cunningly says what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And Haman thinks that he's talking about him, but really the king was talking about Mordechai. And then what happens? The king then told Haman to take the apparel and the horse, and to do so to Mordechai, and he rode through the streets proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Afterward Mordechai returned to the king's gate, and Haman returned home, covering his face and mourning. Zeresh, his wife, then told him that if Mordechai is of the seed of the Jews, then Haman will surely fall before him. So we already start seeing the fall of Haman starting to take place here. You get the seeds of it. Zeresh is already telling that to Haman too. that right after Haman lays out all these requests, thinking that it's going to be for him, the king immediately tells him to go do all that to Mordechai. And so Haman comes back for the first time in the story, covering his face, mourning, and Zeresh starts telling him that if Mordechai is of the Jews, then Haman's definitely going to lose this battle now. So you can already see some kind of twist of events starting to take place. At the banquet, the king asked Esther that whatever she requests, he will grant. She requested to spare her life and the life of her people, the Jews. This is also significant because this is the first time that Esther actually comes out as a Jew in this story. She comes out and she requests to spare her life and the life of her people, meaning the Jews. And she also told the king that Haman wished to harm him. The king was enraged and left the banquet. He was enraged at Haman. Haman, knowing his life was now in danger, begged Queen Esther to spare his life. When the king returned from the garden, there was another event there, and he ordered Haman to be hanged. The king then gave Haman's house to Esther, and Mordechai came before the king. The king gave Mordechai the ring from Haman. This is a very significant one, that Esther was concealing her Jewishness the whole story. When it came to a point when the Jews had followed her command, meaning that the Jews had done efforts to unite, according to what she passed on to Mordechai and to pass on to them, and that there was this united request coming from there to her, so that gave her the confidence to come out as a Jew, meaning that there needs to be a united desire in order for that corrected desire to receive to reveal itself to the Creator, so that it doesn't receive the pleasure coming from the Creator for itself, but that it receives it into this unified kli, that it comes down and it's receiving that pleasure, because she's making the request there not for herself, she's making the request on behalf of her people, as it says there. So that's what gives her the ability to come out. It's a major event here. It shows, it really has a message behind it on what it means to make a genuine prayer, that a genuine prayer, a genuine request, is one which is done not for ourselves, but which is done for the benefit of others, a prayer, what's called the prayer of many, or the prayer of the public, one that's done outwardly for the benefit of others, in this case the Jews, who gave her the ability to request for them, and that's what was able to reveal herself as a Jew to the king in order to benefit all Jews as a result of this. Esther then cried at the king's feet that Haman's command to kill the Jews be reversed. The king agreed and sent out a decree for the Jews to unite, and through their unity to destroy all the forces that come to destroy them. This decree was disseminated throughout Shushan by Mordechai, who went out in royal apparel, and the Jews were happy and feasted. The Jews united, slayed their enemies. Esther made another request to the king to hang Haman's 10 sons, to which he agreed, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. Then the Jews rejoiced, gave portions to each other, gifts to the poor, and celebrated this event, and revered Mordechai as highly as the king. So Mordechai then becomes revealed as this higher righteous Jew, this higher state that becomes as revered to them as the king, because of this loyalty that, as we said, that there's the point in the heart and there's the deeper aspect of that point in the heart. You can say it's the Kabbalists who are before us, those who are able to direct us towards the Creator in as direct way as possible. So they reach this reverence of that quality of Mordechai as highly as the king. The killing of Haman's 10 sons, all these egoistic desires that could come in the way start getting killed off. In general, what we see here is this Jews in a unified prayer, passing that prayer on to Esther, coming out of hiding, disclosing the Jews' desire before the king. That goes up to King Ahasuerus, meaning the Creator, which ends up granting this genuine prayer, this genuine request. It comes down through Mordechai, delivers that message of the need for the Jews' unity, and through the unity and this request being a genuine and proper, correct request, it leads to that final corrected state of that big desire that became revealed through the promotion of Haman to its correction and the Jews living in peace and harmony. This is a certain state that took place in the Second Temple, but we can also apply that same story to ourselves today with what humanity is going through, as we said, when we start seeing it from the perspective of all kinds of desires playing out in us. But that's all we really have time for right now. We just have to have a few messages as we finish off right after this, where we're going to go and do a 1-hour live Q&A. So if you haven't already, you can get your membership for KabU, and we're going to meet soon on Zoom, and you can ask any questions you want, either about this or about any other topics that you want Kabbalah's answers to. I'm Markos, this was Kabbalah Explained Simply, and look forward to seeing you again next time.
This is what Haman as if made against, that he forced us to unite, and we united and came back to the land of Israel and built the second temple. And during the second temple, the same thing happened. We were united on a high level as one man and one heart, as one nation, and again the ego started growing. And at the times of Rabbi Akiva, where he cried out that love, we have to keep that love another as thyself, and no one really listened, and somehow instead of love they reached unfounded hatred.
And we fell into unfounded hatred and were exiled again.
And again,
I want to ask about the war you were talking about, because it's very obviously a spiritual war, in the sense that here you have an enemy, you have someone who is going out to destroy you, and you, instead of fighting back, what you're doing is you're staying among yourselves and you unite among you instead of fighting back. That's a totally different approach than what we normally see when someone comes at you.
That's exactly the correct attitude, because if we unite, then there is no force in the world that can go against us. No force in the world. And this happened throughout the entire history.